State. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
All right, welcome to the Black Myth Podcast. Welcome to the Black Myth Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. This is part 2 of the myth, Communism Made Me Do It. So we're going to return to the second half of the conversation with Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly, who's been on this show many times, and I'm hoping many people enjoy part 1. This conversation is going to be more in the current, as far as how some of the ideas that were articulated in part 1 relate to today's discourse, today's tactics by the state, how Black Scare, Red Scare shows up in today's particular context, and how you still get the same sentiment of the myth that we're talking about, that communism made me do it, showing up in different ways. So you get wokeism, or you get the way that the Stop Cop City protesters are attacked for domestic terrorism, or even thinking about Israel and Palestine and the genocide that's going on over there, and all the different ways that these things are used to in many ways distract us, as we talk about in the episode, but water things down, and then also that they become ways of repression, and we're living through a lot of that right now, particularly in relation to people who are standing up for Palestinians, right? So that's what we're going to be getting into. I'm not going to talk as long. Last episode, I was listening to it after, and I was like, damn, I know I'd be monotone, but I was like passing out, so I apologize. It was late, but that's what we're going to get into. Before we start, I do want to shout out the patrons. We were trying to get to 100. We're over 100 now, so definitely want to thank y'all for that. There was, going all the way back to the last month, it was Steph, and there was Gina Scooter, then there was Dennis Hill, then there's Renee Johnston, who's a part of the platform. Thank you, Renee. And then there was Akua, who was the last to sign up. So thank you, everybody, for coming through. Want to keep getting the patrons up, that helps sustain this show, so definitely appreciate it. So if you have an opportunity, if you haven't already, if you're a regular listener, if this is even your first time, feel free to sign up. You can sign up as low as $1, but anything you have is appreciated. Other than that, we're going to get into the episode. This will be our last myth of the year. The next month we'll be getting into our kind of review of the year, like we typically do. But anyway, appreciate it, and enjoy the episode.
You have your I believe it's the second, it's actually the last chapter, and then after that is the epilogue. Legitimating architecture of U.S. capitalist racist society. I'm admittedly asking about this because this is the only one I feel like I didn't get to sit with as long as some of the other chapters. I had to kind of just speed through it. But I think it does a good job of kind of help connect how we get to where we're at today. Not totally, but it does give us some foundation. So could you, I know we, you don't just want to simply just explain terms, but just kind of what you mean by that, and then how that does maybe create some bridges to understanding some of the trends that have a history in what we've been talking about.
Yeah, so I'm just going to read a little bit this is from the first page of chapter 11, page 225. I'll read the definition and then I'll say a little bit more about it. So, legitimating architecture includes rationalizing discourses, political narrations, reigning ideology, legal instrumentalities, and social practices that normalize and codify U.S. capitalist racist society and Wall Street imperialism. It proffers very particular narrations or presentations of society that obfuscate and conceal, even as they authorize and give meaning to the material reality. During the Black Scare, Red Scare, longue durée, subversion, un-American, sedition, disloyalty, foreign, and threat to national security were key discourses of true Americanism and its constitutive Black scare and Red scare. These work to position capitalist racism as the preeminent system of political, economic, and social organization to which any challenge was dangerous, illicit, and illegitimate. So effectively what I'm saying here, so first let me say, the way that I'm using the term legitimating architecture, I just kind of took that term and made it mean what I wanted it to mean. Because what legitimating architecture actually is that in slave narratives, you would always have a white person that wrote an introduction or a prologue or something to that slave narrative to give it legitimacy, to say, like, this story is actually true. That's what legitimating architecture is.
The white abolitionist or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I just took that term and I thought that, well, this actually is kind of what's happening when we think about the discourses and ideologies that sustain like material exploitation. So in other words, you have to construct Black people as lazy. They ain't got no daddies. They're dangerous. They're criminal. They are susceptible to foreign influence. You have to construct these narratives to legitimate why it is Black people are disproportionately poor. Why they're overrepresented in certain health ailments. Why it is that the places in which we are warehoused tend to be dilapidated, tend to be toxic, tend to be sort of the worst of the worst. So you have to have a reason why this is the reality, right? And so that's what legitimating architecture is. And in the context of U.S. capitalist racist society, what the legitimating architecture does is both rationalize and legitimate why Black people are dangerous, why radicals are dangerous, why Black people and radicals really can't be separated in our sort of discursive imagination, and then why both deserve to be treated differently than real citizens, right? Than true Americans, than those who profess loyalty or a commitment to capitalism, to liberal democracy, to, a survival of the fittest mentality, to individualism, and also a commitment to surveilling, exposing, and distancing themselves from those who are deemed radical, or those who are those who are deemed illegitimate by the state.
So would you be drawing a distinction from just what we call propaganda to, like, would there be a difference between like legitimate architecture and propaganda, or do they coincide? Or how are there differences? I guess is more the effective question.
So propaganda would be a subset of legitimate architecture, because the latter also includes like lawfare, right? It also includes the codification in things that are more sort of concrete and material, right? So propaganda is a key aspect of it, but it's also sort of the laws, legal architecture, the jurisprudence. Those are also like legitimating architecture.
So would it be almost more like a superstructure?
It would be superstructure, but you see, for me, the base and the superstructure are mutually constitutive.
Right.
Because the thing about the United States is that so much, it's almost all ideology. And the ideology has as much of a material effect as the political economy, right? And so the base superstructure, it's not like a classical Marxist thing of like the base determining the superstructure. There are ideologies and narrations that then reproduce sort of different, that then reproduce or recapitulate economic relationships or political relationships, right? So that is to say, and this is the thing about repression and surveillance, is that so much of that stuff is very inaccurate, right? It's made up. It's incorrect. It's just the imagination or the mythology of the state, but then that has real material consequences, right? So the prison industrial complex is as much driven by a sort of privatized fiscal necessity as it is by this massive discursive apparatus that says Black people are criminal and that Black people are potential revolutionaries that need to be warehoused, right? And so you see how the ideology, the ideas then drive the material reality, and the material reality also reproduces ideas, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. I know even with Marx and Engels, I think eventually they did say it was more of they showed more of the dialectical relationship. Like,
exactly.
There's even like a graphic goes around where it's more of it's circular as opposed to top and bottom. Like the superstructure isn't something that simply is produced by the base, but the superstructure, the actions taken of the superstructure affect the base and vice versa. It doesn't mean it's like idealist or anything. It's just you can't have ideas that just only exist as a way of like it representing the base. Like they do take on a life of their own materially, like you said,
Mm-hmm. And this is where like sort of like the media or something comes in, right? Because the media creates all of these stories and all of these narrations that then create concrete policies, right? And they create concrete modes of surveillance that have real sort of, both economic and political effects on people. So, yeah.
I remember Stuart Hall talking about the media being like the he was thinking about, if you think about like more so the means of production, but the media takes like the raw material and refines it and turns it into a story. So it can just be a bunch of data points about Black people, and then the media are like crime wave,
Right, exactly.
or whatever else, and it could be like, oh, CBS read the Communist Manifesto. That's just a data point. But then what's up with all these niggas reading the Communist Manifesto? Like that's the media.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Like a Black person becomes Black people. And that's actually the condition of Blackness. Like elsewhere I've read, I be coming up with all these theories, but that's what, like, Black people are never like individuals, right? What one Black person does is Black people, and what Black people do overdetermines a Black person.
Right. And that's why when, you see Black people get scared when somebody starts fucking up, because they know there's a feeling like, oh, that's going to represent us. A lot of people try to push back, call it respectability politics, whatever, but some of it is just, it's just a material reality. So even if I'm not a believer in respectability politics, like if they're looking for 6-foot Black man,
exactly,
I'm taller than that, or I'm shorter than that, it doesn't matter. Like I'm gonna get
good enough.
Yeah.
Yep. You probably did something anyway because you're Black.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, even if it's not the right Black, he probably did something anyway. He's already guilty.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And even if I'm light skinned or dark skinned, I still, because the image gets made up, whatever. So it's like, yeah, like that. So there's a real paranoia that I think a lot of us walk around with. I guess connecting that to the current, this isn't exactly about Black people, but it is and it's not. I'm just curious how you see, like, with today, with the so-called Israeli-Hamas war, and we've already done an episode on how that framing in and of itself is a myth. But there's this idea, I guess, of, the terrorist label. And then that more broadly, as we know, even with 9/11 and such, applying to brown people, the Muslim community, etc. And that obviously becomes legitimating in many ways to just bomb the shit out of Gaza, because of this so-called terrorists. And they literally say it every time, like, we're trying to find Hamas. So we bombed 500 people today, but we're trying to get to a Hamas. Or, we bombed whatever today, and we're trying to get to Hamas. So I guess, like, echoing examples of the Black Scare Rescue, this seems to be a similar assumption that Palestinians mindlessly follow and protect Hamas, and are therefore like, and we talk about like collective punishment. So do you see any similarities in some of the fear mongering of Hamas to maybe to even something like Bolshevism, along with other radicalism, despite Hamas not even being, like we were talking about with other characters, communists or socialists, to really any extent? They're a nationalist group at best.
Yeah, well, because I feel like there's just been like a transition in the terminology from the communists to the terrorists, right?
Mm-hmm.
That before you could discredit something or legitimate extraordinary violence against a group because they're communists, because they're communist sympathizers, because they're infiltrators, etc. And now it's the same sort of like infrastructure, the same ideological but also material infrastructure that's used to target terrorists now, right? And then in between there was the extremist step, right? There was a step. So you go from the communists to kind of like the Black liberationist people in the 1960s. We know that SWAT came about as a function of suppressing like Black liberationists, right? And then first iteration of the extremist label came about in the 60s and 70s, and then you shift to the terrorists. So it's really like it's discursive shifts, and it is sort of a shift, a geopolitical refocusing. But then a sort of transitory step in that, of course, is like the Russia-Afghani war and some of the stuff that was happening in the Middle East in the late 80s. That's part of the transition to like from the communists to the terrorists as like the archetypal other. But the other way that you kind of see a resonance between Black scare, Red scare in terms of Black and communism being conflated is like the way that it seems like Black people are becoming the face of anti-Semitism, right? So of course you have Palestinians and Arabs, but if you look at a lot of people who are being targeted, so for example, like at Harvard, when they had those trucks going around with people's faces on the trucks, it was Black students. Just yesterday, you had a Black precept, so Black like RA, fired from his job because he used a keffiyeh to shield some pro-Palestine protesters from a student who was trying to like take their pictures, and like people were, they do die-ins and shit. So the student apparently was like stepping on people's heads, and so he was using like de-escalation tactics. He along with others, but he was fired. So that means he got kicked out of the dorm, right? Which has these financial
fired for what?
Violating the rule, like violating Harvard's rules or whatever, but basically anti-Semitism, because the student was, I believe it was a Jewish student, who the precept that got fired was trying to kind of defend the protesters from.
It's funny. We just did a BPM episode on that last night. I didn't know about that specific. I know the president said I condemn from the river to the sea or whatever. But, yeah.
Right, and then of course you have like the Black professor at Cornell, Russell Rickford, who was targeted to the point where he went on leave.
Yep.
You have these Black law students whose offers were rescinded because of their pro-Palestine stuff, and so clearly it's like Arab and Muslim students are sort of the front line of targeting, but then it's Black people. And so again, you see Black people as these vectors of subversion. You see Black people as, always already the sort of face of whatever the radical ill is, even if they're acting in comradeship or in solidarity. It's not to say that they're the only ones who are targeted, but it's overrepresented. Right? Like Black people are overrepresented in that targeting. And so it's the same kind of logic, right? That just as Black people were susceptible to this, like to communist or Moscow's machinations, now it's like Black people are susceptible to this dangerous, anti-Semitic, revolutionary, Palestinian discourse to the point where they're ostensibly supporting terrorists or supporting Hamas for being pro-Palestine. And so Black people are always, the face of this thing. They're always, and they're easy targets, right? And then you've seen also discourse connecting like Black Lives Matter. So there's been different people saying like, if Hamas can do this, then it's only a matter of time before Black people do this in the United States. Or, Black Lives, the Black Lives, they're using the same types of tactics that Black Lives Matter people use, or Black Lives Matter people were also terrorists, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's like of all the things, all the connections that have been made.
No, I'm just BLM has been labeled terrorist by the right, at least,
Of course.
Yeah.
And so of all of the sort of connections that you can make, the connections are to Black Lives Matter, or the connections are to Black people. So again, it's a way of, it's like two birds with one stone. You get the actual threat, which is like pro-Palestine people, and then you get the Black people too, right? So,
right. And I was even thinking about, even when Black people are at least imperfect, or at worst actually just flat out anti-Semites, again, like you said, we become the overrepresentation. So even if you think about someone like Farrakhan,
Kyrie Irving, Nick Cannon,
Kanye, like, it's not, these are not people that I would call friends for the most part. But I'm saying, you know, they become like it becomes like, what's wrong with Black people, specifically in this case, Black men, you know, and then all these archetypes get dragged out about the uncle at the barber shop, and, you know, Black men being deeply all these other things, homophobic, or, you know, deeply anti-Semitic. And it's not to say that, you know, there aren't Black people that are that way. I've met them, you know, I grew up with some of them. Like, sometimes I don't know these people, but they do become a fill-in for like everybody. And then you'll start seeing these articles, sometimes written by Black people, that are trying to all of a sudden trying to understand a very small data point as a representation of what's going on with Black men, what's up with all these. And it was literally 3 celebrities.
And the KKK is right there.
Yeah.
The Proud Boys are right there. The people who are actually burning down synagogues, who are actually shooting up Jewish people, who are actually putting out these manifestos, they're right there.
Yeah.
It's not these 3 Black celebrities. And so again, that's the way that the like Blackness underpins like all of these different types of fears. We also saw it, this is like kind of tangentially related, but we also saw it with the sort of Stop Asian Hate. All of a sudden, Black people become the, you know, the face of this anti-Asian thing. And again, it's not to say that there aren't some Black people who, you know, just like any other demographic, but then it's like Black people become the faces of those who are targeting and who are abusing Asian folks. It's not the rampant state xenophobia, right? It's not the ongoing and intensified like discourse or rhetoric against China, against North Korea, you know, it's not the strengthening of the Indo-Pacific Command, which is meant to, again, you know, to push U.S. hegemony in the Pacific. Of course, it's Black people who are like beating up Asian folks, and then they become the face of Asian hate. So, you know, it's like, that's what sort of a sort of broader reading of Black Scare, Red Scare helps us understand, is like, why is it that Black people become that like preeminent danger? And then the other side to it is then the sort of the way that Black people then become conscripted into empire. So then on the other side, you have like these Black handkerchief head Zionists who then, you know, they're compelled to or choose to protect themselves in particular ways, just really tout the Zionist line, you know, either for AIPAC money or just for protection, right? And so the whole Black Scare, Red Scare thing, the other, you know, I write about Black Cold War liberalism, but if we extend that analysis, it's like Black people are compelled to show that they're more American than white Americans, that they're more patriotic, that they can tout the line better than any other group. Because if they don't, right, then they become the face of the enemy. You know, so.
Yeah, and I remember you in that piece, you were talking about Cold War liberalism. I actually cited that in my book, but you talk about how the term is leaving me, but basically there was a demobilizing effect.
Agency reduction
formation.
Yeah,
agency reduction formation. It's in the book, but I totally am not remembering it right now. But yeah, there's an agency reduction because if you're starting to try to prove that you are American or that you're loyal, like basically like the things you talk about, like you talk about in the book, how the anti-communism isn't always from the top down. So there's this way that people start to police themselves and police other people, you know. So like it does reduce the agents. I don't think you actually use agency formation in the book, but in that piece you're talking about, there's a sense where now we feel like we have to shut these things down. Even when white folks, aren't even on the radar, or they're not even, the state overall isn't even thinking about it, but we have to kind of police it. And then, like you said, well, some people have legitimate beefs with communism, or at least with communist organizations. Communism maybe not as a whole, but with communist organizations like A. Philip Randolph. But there becomes this chilling effect where people also just don't even get to think about certain ideas because they're policing themselves away from it, So I don't even want to consider what communism could look like, because people would tell you that'll get you killed, or that'll get you sent in prison, or it's a white people thing, or or whatever, and all those things just keep you away from a different possibility or even future, because you're just like, well, we need to prove that we're American descendants of slaves. We need to just get our reparations,
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I always say, it's like, you don't have to be a communist or a socialist, but if you are anti-communist, you are actively working towards your own repression, because historically the way that communism and radicalism has been so closely linked to civil rights, to Black self-determination, to Black liberation, that you can have legitimate beefs, like with a party, right? With the CQUSA or with any of the other, the contemporarily with like the new parties that have formed, because there are legitimate differences. There are legitimate beefs. White chauvinism was a thing back then, but to be anti-communist, because that's what the thing, when I write about A. Philip Randolph and the March on Washington movement, he was still surveilled. The FBI still targeted the March on Washington movement and still try to paint it as Bolshevik, even though A. Philip Randolph worked very, very hard to wear to wave the anti-communist banner. It's like, it doesn't help you. Ultimately, you still will go to jail. Like, you still will be targeted if you have anything that is aligned with like a communist talking point or a communist directive, or like a communist platform. You're communist because you're Black, and because you believe in ideas that are antithetical to the U.S. project, like Black self-determination, like decolonization, like economic democracy, as we like to say now, because we don't want to say communist. So, it's just not helpful.
Yeah, it just seems like you can't. I don't know. It again, like you said, you can, if you disagree with things on the premise of their own ideas or their own claims, that's fine. So if you just think, communism, like I mean, you read like Dr. King's critiques of communism, it didn't feel like that was legitimately how he felt about it. Not so much, him trying to prove anything. He just...
and they still called him a communist.
Right. But I'm saying, I guess my point is, like, you could disagree, but he was also not an anti-communist. Like, he wasn't really for a lot of the oath keeping that, that was going on. And, reading further, he would often push back against that with some of the more... But he also had to maintain, like, the white funding. So he had to be, navigate that. But yeah, there's no... I mean, again, people can agree or disagree for things however they want, but to then be like, well, that's a reason why we should just totally reject these lines of thought, with knowing the history, like, that doesn't line up. Like, you might be able to protect yourself at a given moment, but eventually, the state will come for you, because that's just how, like, anything that leads to Black people doing anything that's not like murderous for ourselves is always going to be subversive on some level.
And the communists are like the canary in the coal mine, because if you look at Mussolini, if you look at Hitler, the first people that they really were attacking were like the communist parties, and so
World War II, yeah.
And if spoiler alert, it didn't stop there. They just were the first, right? And so again, it's like, you can disagree with the whole ideology of communism, you can disagree with the parties, whatever. When you're like actively cheering that repression, when you're engaged, when you are abetting that repression by snitching, by, trying to keep these, by painting these people as objectively and inherently dangerous, as opposed to actually organizing and working toward a better world, then you are setting your own self up for failure if your belief system or if your praxis is also antithetical to the U.S. state. i.e., again, Black liberation. So it just doesn't, and that's again one of the sort of upshots of the book is that, Black people cannot afford to align with the state against dissidents and others because we are constitutively dissidents. We are constitutively others. And so, and more often than not, we've had more in common with political minorities like socialists and communists, white supremacy and racism notwithstanding, but we've had more in terms of transformation. We've had more in common with these people than with the U.S. state, which has had generally more in common with fascists.
Right. Last point on this, and I'll move to Rico. Basically think about even though Russia is not a communist country at all anymore, but Russia has been branded because of all this history still within this kind of, boogeyman vibe, even though the Soviet Union collapsed, a long time ago at this point, over 30 years ago. But with the Trump kind of red baiting that happened, where there was this idea that Trump was this Russian spy, and a lot of us cheered this on because we didn't like Trump. We thought any way to get him out was fine. But you see how that laid the groundwork for a lot of shit that's coming, at the so-called left, and even when it was happening, there was, a lot of Black red scare stuff as far as like people were being duped by Russia. The Black Lives Matter account was run by a Russian account. And therefore, a lot of the Black Lives Matter groups didn't legitimately have critiques of Hillary Clinton. It was just being gassed up by the right. But at the same time, it's just funny how, again, like you said, since they don't really believe in anything, these things, the definitions are just floating. They kind of change up because, again, Russia is not the Soviet Union, right? But it still signifies a very similar approach to where now there's the same thing, the subversive, the conspiracy, the foreign agent, and we're not thinking for ourselves,
Right. So I write in the epilogue about the African People's Socialist Party, who were indicted under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is the same act that W.B. Du Bois was indicted under in 1951 for being agents of Moscow. And one of the examples that they used was that the APSP had charged the United States with genocide. Now, as we know, the first charge of genocide against the United States came from the Civil Rights Congress in 1951. I write about the We Charge Genocide petition extensively in the book. And, the CRC was a sort of communist adjacent organization. It wasn't a communist front, but it was a communist adjacent organization. And William Patterson, who was the architect of the We Charge Genocide petition, was a member of the Communist Party. But his passport got suspended after he filed that with the United Nations. Paul Robeson's passport got suspended, or in fact had gotten suspended previous to that. But the people who signed on to that petition or who were the architects of that petition suffered like state repression because it was thought that this has to be emanating from elsewhere. It's not the meticulously documented terrorism that Black people are subjected to, the economic subjection, the attempts to eliminate African Americans in whole or in part through this sort of very slow but consistent and all-encompassing violence to which we're subjected and have been subjected for a long time, that this has to emanate from elsewhere. And so the idea that a charge of genocide today is somehow enacted by some Russian, or the idea of some Russian agent is, number one, ahistorical, but number two, it fits very neatly into this broader sort of idea that Black people are the easiest and most susceptible agents of foreign influence. And so the fact that Russia is not communist doesn't matter. They're still an enemy of the United States. And the Red Scare is fundamentally about identifying and neutralizing enemies of the United States from without and from within. And especially when you can connect enemies from without to already suspect groups within the United States. And so it's the same thing with China. There was this whole discourse about how China was funding some of the 2020 uprising, which is, anyway, I'm not going to get into the whole China thing, but like, you know, it's always somebody, right? It's always somebody that the Black people are in cahoots with that, again, it can't possibly be that we have a legitimate analysis and critique of our own material conditions. It always has to be at least either funded or influenced by or wholly created by somebody out there.
Right. We could never, like, to the point of the overall myth, could just arrive at a position because it just makes sense. Like that can just never be true. It always has to be something else is at play, misinformation, disinformation,
Yep.
falling for Russian bots. We get called Russian bots, like quite literally, or genocide deniers or whatever, because it can't be that we just actually believe this, whether it's right or wrong. It isn't even the point. It can't be that we've just genuinely arrived at a position that never can, happen.
Exactly.
So on to another current event, Stop Cop City. There was these RICO charges that many of the protesters in Atlanta got hit with, and similar, like you were talking about with the African Socialist Party and everyone else, not everyone else, but a lot of the other places you've cited throughout the book. It's the domestic terrorism and all of this stuff that they're getting hit for is essentially, mutual aid or making a claim in a protest, allegedly, a very loose-based shit that has nothing to do with, whatever terrorism even is supposed to mean. But then it's also a RICO, which comes out of a lot of drugs, like trying to catch people on organized crime and all of that. So do you see any parallels there with the Red Scare, Black Scare theme as well?
Yeah, I can't find like a concrete source, but I'm just convinced that these large Smith Act trials, which were basically they're basically early RICO-like charges, because you find one person guilty and everybody in that entire organization or in the entire leadership of that organization is then guilty by association or guilty just by virtue of belonging to that thing. And that's what RICO is, right? And basically, the Communist Party was painted as a criminal organization, a criminal enterprise. It just wasn't like they weren't charged with like drug trafficking, but they were charged with crimes against the United States government, right? Trying to overthrow the government by force or violence. And so it's the same. So I believe that those giant trials, where again over 150 like communist leaders were indicted, and many of them went to prison or were deported, etc., that is like the architecture for like a RICO-like case for conspiracy. I talked about Angelo Herndon. Angelo Herndon was charged with insurrection in Georgia. So there's a lot of resonances actually between Angelo Herndon's case and then what's happening with Cop City. Again, for just possessing literature. The other parallel is that one of the first groups that were hit with the, I want to say the, not insurrection, but the domestic terrorist charge, I think, was the bail fund. And there's right, because they were bailing them out of jail, bailing
they said they were like laundering money and shit too. That's what they tried to say.
Precisely. And so there are so many people, including Alpheus Hunton, who went to jail for not naming names in terms of people who had donated money to like the Civil Rights Congress or the Council on African Affairs, these organizations that appeared on the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. And so they were held in contempt for not turning over the names of donors, because it was assumed that, because these donors could then be indicted. These donors could then be in prison for donating or be painted as communists or communist sympathizers or whatever for having donated that money. So it's a similar type of logic. But like, the RICO, what these RICO cases are meant to do is a similar thing that those large communist trials were meant to do, which is to like scare people, which is to like deter people from engaging in any type of organizing or activism, which is to paint the whole Cop City movement as criminal, as dangerous, as illegitimate, as outside agitators. So you heard a lot of this discourse about outside agitators when it came to Stop Cop City, that people were coming from outside of Atlanta, from elsewhere, to stir up trouble, when we know indeed, in fact, there's organizations like Community Movement Builders and a lot of local organizers. There was BAP Atlanta, et cetera, et cetera. So many local organizers, a multiracial group, which again, multiracialism is also a key. It's a way that black scare, red scare comes together. It's like, it's not just black people doing stuff. It's like when black and white people mix, that interracialism becomes a danger, right?
The nigger.
But anyway.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Nigger, like the nigger lover and the fellow traveler, I talk about this in the book, become sort of parallel ideas. And then there's sort of two narrations about that. It's like, again, the blacks are susceptible to like the ideas of these wild-eyed radicals like the anarchists or whatever, or, black people are tainting otherwise.
Or it's not, I've heard with the Cop City specifically, it's, from people like Killer Mike, I don't see black people talking about this, or the working class black people. So it implies that the critique, again, comes from the outside. This is white people, ascending into, or descending down on Atlanta and bringing and stirring things up,
Exactly.
because they couldn't, again, black people in Atlanta couldn't just be mad about this themselves, right?
Right. The people who are subjected to the most amount of policing and surveillance and, police brutality, police repression, welcome, a multi-million-dollar police complex in their neighborhood, right? To have pigs living in their neighborhood, in traditionally black neighborhoods. Like, of course, black people are just okay with that because we love to get our ass whooped and we're completely fine with our immiseration. So those are the sort of parallels that I see between like the Stop Cop City movement and some of the repression that was happening in the moments I talk about in this book.
Okay, yeah. And I guess one more, and then I'll just ask a final question after that. As far as there's been this, it's just an interesting time, for this book to come out because there's a lot of resurgence. Again, it's not that these things ever fully go away, but just the visibility of these things have gotten pretty bright the last few years. But so there's been this resurgence of like anti-wokeism, which is interesting because the very people who were complaining about wokeism are now very soft, despite how they called everybody else over the Palestinian issue. So they're suspending organizations and all this, but initially the point was wokeism was like denying free speech. That was one of the bigger points they try to push forward as being legitimate. Like there's these soft left-leaning kids on college campuses and online, particularly on TikTok, who are, pushing these anti-American ideas, right, about United States is founded on racism. So you see people like DeSantis take some of the hardest lines, like you can't even have a class that makes white people feel uncomfortable and all of this stuff. So even books that, for my opinion, aren't even that good or really don't enlighten us on much of anything, even those books get banned, right? So even things that are soft, in my opinion, are still seen as subversive. I won't name those books, so I'm not trying to necessarily call anybody out, but we know what those books are. So even that has been a thing. So I mean, I don't know what other ways are we to connect that. I mean, that seems rather obvious to me if people are listening haven't already thought about it, but I'm curious how you see those connections too. I know you wrote about that in the epilogue.
Yes, the anti-wokeism stuff is like multifaceted. Number one, it is meant to basically circumscribe the terms of discourse. So you can't talk about racial equality. You can't talk about any LGBTQ stuff. You can't talk about anything that challenges the way the United States narrates itself. So it's a disciplining technique, right? And woke is such a nebulous word that it means like everything and nothing. The other thing is it creates this dynamic where oppressed folks become the oppressor, right?
Yeah.
So it's like we can't say nigga, we can't Thomas Jefferson.
We're hurting white people's feelings.
Right.
We're beating up on people. We need to hold space. Blah, blah.
Right. Because we can't do those things, that becomes the oppression, which then erases or actually obfuscates what the actual oppression is. And that's what I was saying about legitimating architecture. It's a technique of obfuscation. It makes the actual problem, not the problem, and overlays the actual violence, actual oppression, actual domination with all of these other things through, the denigration of Black people. And so wokeism is means Black, right? The attack on woke is an attack on like Black, anything from liberal Black bullshit to Black liberation struggles, right? And then the important thing about the attack on the liberal Black bullshit is that if that becomes what the left is, the thing about what the actual left, how dangerous and how subversive the actual left is. If fucking how to be an anti-racist is the Communist Manifesto, imagine what Black Scare, Red Scare is, right? So that's the other thing that it does. But the other thing, again, the attack on wokeism also is very concomitant with, or very sort of parallel to, like, the criminalization of protest. So the Stop Woke Act that was passed in Florida, there was another sort of anti-organizing bill that was brought before the Florida Congress at the exact same time that would basically criminalize, like, blocking highways, that would criminalize taunting the police. So all of these things go together.
To people who ran them over, gave cover to those drivers too. Yeah.
Exactly. And you see that this legislation, which has been passed, this sort of anti-organizing legislation, which actually has been passed in several states, it wasn't in response to something like January 6th.
Mm-mm.
It wasn't passed in response to something like Charlottesville. It's in response to, like, George Floyd, right? Black and interracial organizing against both state repression, but also, like, racial domination. And so, again, wokeism becomes a way to, just as sort of the attack on communism and radicalism became a way to attack Black people after 1954, like when it became less, it became more uncouth to, you had to basically be more subtle with your racism, right? You had to be more subtle with your attack on civil rights. So too is, like, wokeism a way to attack Black people and attack, whatever nominal gains were made after 2020, but not say that, right? But not say Black people don't deserve shit. It's to say, oh, the wokeism, it's anti-American, it's anti-liberal, it's all this other bullshit, right?
And then even associating it against, like, trans kids, and now we're talking about and now wokeism is, I know that's not totally Black, but it's still, like, associated with this, un-American, but also just, like, perverted, like, now these are,
right. It's like, it's another minority that, again, has historically is antithetical to what it means to be American, antithetical to what it means to be a legitimate citizen or a legitimate, like, political subject, right? And so, yeah, and so it's LGBTQ because, again, that and trans undermines the white supremacist heteropatriarchal logic of this society, just as Black liberation undermines the white supremacist, even in many ways, like, heteropatriarchal kind of bourgeois family structure of this society, right? The way that we organize our lives doesn't fit neatly into the reproduction of the nation state. So yeah, so those are the two primary targets, because these are things that make, white straight people feel like, the future is not for them. It's just not, but it's like, you had enough of human history, like, it's not for you, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong or incorrect.
Right, yeah, those things just, again, they web it all together, and it also just all of this stuff, and this is true, I've even learned with, like, political prisoners, like, you would spend your time now trying to, like, change laws, like, it pulls you it pulls you towards the right, not because you believe in it, just because you just get caught up in trying to survive the society because they're just throwing all these repressive laws. So now we're suing the same government, saying this is unconstitutional, or, this is a violation of free speech or whatever. And in some ways, you're kind of affirming that society by arguing on those terms. You're saying this is within the framework of the United States. This is actually unfair, and because we live here, we deserve these rights. And I'm not saying people shouldn't make those arguments, because you got to sometimes. But I'm just saying there's a way that, even if it's not intentionally done, has a way of reinscribing the state and has a way of moving things to legalism and all of that shit, right? So you can't really pursue the things that you may even believe in, on a broader sense, because you're trying to get people out of prison, or you're trying to prove that, trans kids are going to destroy the society, or, or like we talked about, you try to behave even your own self and show that I'm not one of those people. I remember even on LDI that time, we had, what's her name? Brianna Joy Gray. Am I saying that correctly? I always say Gray Joy. It's a Game of Thrones reference.
Game of Thrones, yeah.
But we had her on it, and this isn't to try to rehash what happened in the chat that day, but just I remember we had a conversation even as another part of that episode, but just about how this wokeism stuff, you start trying to correct other people on it. And it seemed like that was kind of her argument, that we can't go up to, as if any of us do. There was just this caricature that we go up to everyday Black people and start yelling about the most radical thing. And she's like, well, that's going to scare them. Well, she was talking about white folks, right?
You're talking about white, but you can't call white people racist.
Yeah. And so then it just becomes this thing where you almost you buy into this idea about yourself, and then you try to police something that was made up anywhere, right. Or at least exaggerated.
It's two things. One, capital funds its own opposition, right? And so it sets the terms of what the debate will be. And secondly, what's happening with the whole woke thing is that we're letting the right, and even the critical race theory and all this shit, it's you're letting the right actually dictate the terms of the debate. You don't actually care about this shit. Nobody gives a fuck about critical race theory doesn't mean anything. If critical race theory was gone tomorrow, I would not care, because I'm a Black studies scholar. What I do, Black Scare Rescue ain't got shit to do with critical race theory, right? There's many critiques of critical race theory, but it becomes a blanket term. It's crazy because people who don't do critical race theory, who are just Black historians, for example, then find themselves defending critical race theory when it's this has nothing to do with what you're doing. So why are you spending so much time, number one, trying to paint your work as critical race theory, only to defend critical race theory? So it as you're saying, it becomes a distraction. The other example for it is the Black Studies AP course.
Yeah.
Most of our students are not in AP classes. The problem is the educational infrastructure itself. It's not the Black Studies AP. And then you're defending this fucking milquetoast, watered down bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a distraction, right? But it's that way because we feel like we have to defend every little thing because so much is taken away, right? And then also there's a class component to it. There's a bourgeois element. When we think about the rise of the NGO industrial complex, the nonprofit industrial complex, and the professionalization of organizing and activism, then you have petty bourgeois folks who are sort of become the faces of organizing in a particular way, which also skews, which then also is reactive and responsive to what the state says the problem is. So, right now, for example, there's a way in which we can get distracted by from the river to the sea. Right. If it is, if it's anti-Semitic, if it's calling for Jewish genocide or not. Perhaps that's important to the extent that if you say it, you might get thrown in jail. It's important in that regard, but that is not the point. The point is that there is a war-driven intensification of genocide happening right now.
Yeah.
And so again, when we let the ruling class, the dominant society, set the terms of the debate, we find ourselves putting our revolutionary energy towards shit that actually doesn't even fucking matter.
Yeah.
And that becomes, and that's a function of something like Black Scare, Red Scare, because it's such a blitz attack, right? It's on what you say, what you do, who you associate with, what organization you belong to, et cetera, et cetera. And then you just pick, you are perpetually on the defensive to the point where the world that you want to build, the society you want to build, becomes a back burner to just defense.
Yeah. But it's never, even if the goal is revolution, you don't even get to do it because you're
exactly
try to defend your right to exist, in a very narrow way. Like you're just like, I have these rights or
you go from Black liberation to Black Lives Matter. It's not about liberation anymore. It's like we matter. We're here and we should be here because we're human.
Right. And even that gets right.
Exactly.
And then you try, but again, a lot what I find interesting for me personally, or just from honestly, for me politically, but where I stand politically, again, that's why I try to stay out of some of these conversations, because it's like I don't really want to defend some of these books. I mean, I don't think they should be banned, I mean, maybe, but I'm saying I don't necessarily think that they should be banned, but I don't really think anybody should read them. But if they do, that's their choice, but you find yourself in a position like, and then people, like you said, people think that's radical, and not just like the ruling class, but like average people think that the radical thing is said book or said position. Critical race theory is all Black thought or something, when it's not really that widely studied or taught really overall. It's its own field, but that then you even people like us, or particularly yourself, are going to get invited to talk about things that you're not even associated with, because they're just like, oh, it's a Black scholar, let me ask her, she talks about radical Black shit, and all Black shit is kind of radical anyway, right? Like that's how they think. So anything could go here. Like, so it also just like dilutes Black thought, like how we respect it, you know what I mean? Like there's no like real consideration for Black people's differences in thought and political ideas. It's just like, well, it's all that Black radical shit that all just throws in the bag,
Which is why, if it is that even the most liberal milquetoast bullshit is either going to get co-opted or repressed, you might as well just do the radical thing.
Yeah.
You might as well be as radical and as militant and as forceful as you can be, because they're going to come for you anyway. And if they come for, if it is that the liberal shit becomes the radical shit, then we double down on liberal shit, then we're forced to just defend that thing, and that becomes the horizon of possibility. So if it is that Blackness is always already going to be subversive, seditious, a threat to national security, targeted, criminalized, you might as well do the most radical thing. You might as well have courage now, because they're going to come for you anyway, and perhaps you'll get a better outcome, better political education, better consciousness raising, than reading or organizing around like recognition.
Yeah. I mean, if the civil rights was a compromised civil rights movement because of a lot of the things you're talking about, not to say some people didn't legitimately believe in this or that, but when you look at the history, there was an obvious sense of trying to avoid internationalism for a long time, to avoid specifically anti-capitalist critique. You had to couch it in other stuff, whether you still got attacked or not. But even that compromise was stronger than a lot of what's out today. And that got watered down. So what the hell you think they're going to do with shit that's even more watered down? And they're going to water down the shit that they watered down, So it just kind of keeps going. So it's like, yeah, you might as well do the thing, because they're not going to, And what I worry about, last point on this, is like I was at a performance back in September, and this Black girl came up to me afterwards, and I had said something criticizing DEI. She's like, how do you So she asked me, she's like, how do we stop DEI from being co-opted? I was like, DEI is the co-op.
It's the co-optation, right? It is the technique of co-optation. Like, what the fuck? What would co-opted DEI mean? I guess, I don't know, maybe white people would be diversity. I don't know, but it's like, it's already co-opted.
Yeah, but that just showed you how far gone it is. Like, she didn't even know anything past. I was like, you should look at things past that. I was like, DEI already waters down the stuff that you're trying to get to. You know, they put it in a certain framework. So even if you're reading about like Asada, it gets watered down, and it's just like a representation of being a radical Black woman, just like as a representation, not the general party she belonged to or the politics, you know, and we could go on and on with that. So like, I was like, because I think I said something during the talk, I was being tongue-in-cheek. I said people who water down I was talking about the words themselves, diversity, equity, and inclusion. They water down the words themselves, and they call it DEI. Because even those words could mean something differently, but when they put it together as the acronym, it's BS. So she thought I meant DEI as a program. I'm like, nah, this is all, and I thought I said that and talked about that. This is all bad. It's like, it's already watered down. But that's what I'm saying. Like, you got kids coming up, they don't know any better, especially if they're in these colleges and these kind of, you know, petty bourgeois settings, and they really think like this is the thing to defend. Like, I don't even need to know about, and even if they know about your book, they will put it in the same category as said other things, you know, because they don't understand the distinctions. Like, it collapses the categories. And I think that's a concern to look at moving forward. Last question. This is like the cheesy kind of hopeful question. What do you hope your book and overall theory can do to serve fights for liberation? What are ways different movements can apply it?
I mean, I think, you know, part of what I do is like I you know, develop a kind of constellation of vocabularies that can help. But, and again, it's not like I don't think I say anything that is exceptionally novel or new. I just bring it together in a different way. And, you know, it's just that people don't know about it. I think that's the thing about being a historian. When you use archival documents, it shows that somebody already said this shit. You're just bringing it back and giving it a sort of, you're configuring it in a different way. And so I think, you know, thinking about Black people, for example, as subproletariat helps us to understand, like, how do we need to organize and think about labor? How do we put Black people at the center of that, not in a chauvinistic way, but in a way that says, if we do not look at this group of workers, we are not going to have a labor movement that actually benefits the majority, you know? I think that, so I hope that it brings like imperialism back into our analysis. I hope it helps us to understand how capitalism and racism mutually inform each other, and how ubiquitous, you know, repression is, and that despite that, we have to, and that people kept going. There are people who were organizing for 50, 60 years despite all of this repression because they belonged to organizations, and when their organizations got shut down by the government, they started new organizations. They engaged in other types of other types of tactics. Some went underground, some went into exile, et cetera, but they still did work. And that, you know, and I just hope it puts like radicalism back on the table, as we've been talking about in the, you know, for the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so. Like, liberalism is not the only option. And we have a blueprint. We have a long history of people doing the radical thing and being successful, because really any gains we've made with respect to labor, race relations, et cetera, really comes from the left. It just gets bastardized when it becomes codified. Like, if we think about anything from like the 8-hour workday to even like holding the U.S. accountable on the international stage, that was radicals. That was particularly communists and socialists who did that. And so, and again, as you know, I said earlier, if they're gonna demonize, criminalize, illegitimize the radical thing, or the liberal thing, the radical thing, whatever, you might as well just do the radical thing. You might as well really ground with people. You might as well turn to the grassroots and not the petty bourgeoisie, because you're gonna come up against this sort of repression and violence anyway. So those are just some of the takeaways that I hope, I wrote this with sort of activists and organizers in mind, but it's still a sort of academic book. So it's not an easy read. It's not something that there are sort of ready action items, but I think that it's a source of fortification, right? It's a way to sort of see that there's a long history of not only the repression, but also the forms of organizing that were the target of that repression. And then also like for academics, right? For scholars who want to be like guerrilla intellectuals or who want to do work that matters, it's like you can do this work in academia. Like academia is what it is, but you can you can do meaningful work. And not only it is your responsibility to do like meaningful work. It's your responsibility to militate against the ethics, epistemology, and politics of the dominant university. That's like our historical task. And you can do that in a way that's still rigorous and that, allows you to keep your job, but like do things that matter. So anyway, I hope that those are some of the takeaways.
Yeah, I would just say I think it helps ground a materialist analysis of things, and I think we need more of that. There's a lot of vibes
Absolutely
out here. So it's a lot of
right.
We vibe out on being Black, and it just is a very amorphous. And there's a time and a place for that stuff, I guess. But I just think that a more historically and materially grounded analysis is just helpful, because when you ground your stuff in history, also when you're theorizing, you can't really stray away as far as some people do, because you got to always come back to what did the history actually say.
It has to be rooted in something,
right?
Yeah, and that's the other thing I'll say is like, I got no smoke with the Black feminist, but like, I am a Black woman. I write about Black women. Feminism is not the only framework through which you can care about Black women's liberation. I think that's another thing too, is that you can be like, anti-imperialism was the lens through which somebody like Claudia Jones fundamentally understood triple oppression, for example, right? And if you do identify as a Black feminist, make sure it is not the liberal feminism that has been captured by the state. It's not intersectional imperialism. That is a feminism or a gender politic that actually is liberatory, right? Same with race. If you have a racial politic, make sure it actually has some type of class analysis, or you're just reproducing the dominant paradigm in blackface. And so, I mean, I think that that's important as well.
Yes.
And if you have a class analysis, race fucking matters. Like, these white folks that are so hostile to settler colonialism and to internationalism and to like Black, anything that they try to call everything so-called identity politics, is like, you're not gonna fucking get anywhere except for anyway, MAGA communism, I guess, whatever, but like, race fucking matters, and there's a way to do it that's liberatory, right? So
yeah, that was something else I did say when we were talking about how things get collapsed. I was more so thinking about how it affects our thinking of it, but also you end up with, when you demonize the wokeism stuff, and I even got to be careful with some of my own work, and I've seen other people have to go through this. Like, even if you like are critical, like class, sometimes the white people will try to attach themselves to you or to your kind of thought as a way to, because they feel like they can't critique those Black people. So now they want to use us as kind of those people.
Conduits. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's like, we didn't enter into it for that. We're not even talking to y'all, you know what I mean? But they'll sometimes use, I've noticed white leftists, even if they don't actually talk to me, they'll just use the work of people I know or people we know to kind of be like, well, Fred Hampton did organize with racists, so you guys should, or whatever. And it's like, so there becomes this kind of anti-identity politics on the so-called left that I actually think is very reactionary, and doesn't help anything. Again, they allow what corporations and what the government does in their co-opting of these things to become representative of all ideas that even consider the fact that people are not just like in a group of a class, that they maybe possess other forms of identity that make up that class.
Yeah, other structural location. That's why I try not to use words like positionality and identity and all that type of thing in my work, because it's like, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a material reality that requires an understanding of how Blackness has operated in this country and has been its own sort of formation, even as it's very much related to dominant class formations, right? Even as it's not separable from that, but that we have to take seriously, like racialization, and not in a petty bourgeois sort of reductive way.
Yeah, Eric.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it's still part of the material reality. So I don't know how you can call yourself a Marxist and just dismiss most material reality because you don't want to talk about it. Like, you're not a serious person as far as I'm concerned.
And it's like, I'm just convinced that these fucking people know no Black workers. It's like, you must only know Black petty bourgeois people, like, or it's a straw man attack. Like, you're only taking like Patrice Cullors or whoever the fuck, and that's your model for all the things that Black people. It's like, you don't know any real Black people. You can't know any real like Black grassroots organizers if you think any mention of races is like identity reductionism. It's like, you can't know any Black people for real if that's what you think.
But I think that's part of the program, is also to make Black petty bourgeois problems the face of racism, or what racism is experienced as, because it's just also not as sympathetic. Like, if the worst thing that happens to Black people is microaggressions, then it's also just not something that other groups of people and even other Black people who will deal with worse things can sympathize with. So if microaggressions becomes the kind of fill-in for what racism is for people, how they experience it, or something more of that effect, then it's just kind of like, so if I'm thinking, I'm not defending white people, but I guess I'm just saying, like, if I don't know any better as anyone, and I'm like, that's what we're doing all these protests for, because of microaggressions at work, or whatever. So it's like, yeah, there's ignorance, and there's people who choose to not address other things, but there is a role that some of those people play in talking about the more petty bourgeois Black folks, as far as watering down what racism is to just like these kind of personal hurt feelings, right? Now, some of that.
I wrote all about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It gets cast because, no matter how rich you are, no matter how successful you are, white people still don't like you. So.
So yeah, that becomes and then those are the people that get brought in to talk, and they often bring those experiences. So that doesn't help build solidarity, because something I always thought about is how on one end you have the co-optation, the watering down, whatever words you want to use. But you obviously on the other end you get the repression, but the repression comes like the people who do the co-opting often aren't going to protect you from the repression, but the repression is somewhat informed by watering down what people are already going through anyway. So Black Lives Matter, the real struggles that people are pushing for become reduced to representation, then that just gasses up the reactionaries even more. And then the people who say we stand with Black lives and we put the flag in our yard or we put out a statement are nowhere to be found when the repression comes. They're not defending you. Like they just leave you to the wolves. So they just shred you out. And then when it's time to pass the repressive bills or put people in prison, these liberals aren't really here to even defend you against that in most cases, other than maybe a lawsuit here and there. A few of them will, but often this is to their own creation, because you gas up the right. It's not that they become racist because of these watered down ideas. They choose that, but it does not help when you don't gain allies when you already watered down the cause, so. And
we see this, right? With the Palestine situation, there has been so many folks like, we stood with Black Lives Matter, we marched in 2020, and now you Black people, how dare you Black people care about genocide? How dare you care about decolonization? Like, it's transactional, right? It's like, because, white people, because, it's transactional allyship or whatever, that Black people owe them, we owe them our ethics. We owe them like our soul. Like we can't be honest and objective in our analysis of what's happening because white people marched during George Floyd, or, some people took it back to march with MLK. Shit, I don't, them old ass motherfuckers. I don't know. I wasn't there. But, and so that's also a function of that, right? Like we showed up for you in this very limited way. Therefore, shut the fuck up.
Yeah, there was an article, I think, at the Jewish paper Record. And they said it was a op-ed, said, "Hey, Black Lives Matter activists, we can't breathe too." Something. I don't know if it said activists. It said, "Hey, BLM, something, we can't breathe too." And it was speaking Zionist Jews.
The the phosphorus bombs, right? The Palestinians can't breathe. So,
right.
For real. And it's not a fucking metaphor. So,
yeah. Like they're literally going through that. So yeah, it's interesting how these dynamics play out. It just, again, to our point earlier, it becomes a distraction. Like I'm not even talking about. So anyway, not to continue to go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, I think people should read it because it helps. Even if you are used to, hopefully if you listen to this show, you're not, but even if you are used to a more vibed out Black, whatever, this isn't that, and we have enough of those books. But I would suggest reading it just because it grounds things in a material reality. Like you can't get lost in the clouds with this book. At the moment you do, you're back in reading about the Sedition Act again, or whatever.
Right.
Million McCarran and all of the other stuff. Like you're right back. Like I made a whole sheet of all the laws and committees because I couldn't keep up with them, so I wrote them all down on a sheet, and I don't even think I got all of them. It's a very long list.
There's a lot, and that's only some of them.
Yeah. American Committees for Protection of Foreign-Born, long acronyms, ACPFB, and I ain't gonna read them all because that's for people to read the book, but there's a lot of reports and committees and laws to go around. So anyway, thanks for coming on here. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say, but, thanks for coming through. I know you're busy, so.
Yeah, thanks for having me. As always, engage in political education, join a revolutionary movement organization, and courage is a muscle. It's what's the book will also show you is that the repression we're facing today is nothing new, and people still did what needed to be done. So the more courageous you are, the more easily engaging in courageous acts will come to you. So get active. We don't have time.
All right, y'all heard it first from her. All right, peace out.
All right, bye.
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck